So thank you for joining us today for our episode 5. We're on a bit of a roll now, aren't we,
Yeah.
getting these out? I wanted to speak to you really because after the Moment of Contact, the new Netflix documentary about the case in Virginia, Brazil, is it? And at first I thought, oh yeah, what's this case? You know what I mean? Ships landing and army officer literally picking up and running to the hospital with a being. I was like, yeah, this is whatever. I don't believe this. And then I watched it, and I was like, okay, I'm convinced now. You know what I mean? You've convinced me pretty quickly. But yeah, you hear stories like that, and obviously, you've got the main ones like Roswell and things. But I wanted to sit down really and kind of talk about like more British stories, because you have there's obviously the main big ones, but there's not. I don't think it gets as much kind of coverage, does it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's like with more things, American. They tend to hog the market, whether it be movies or music or whatever. I mean, for obvious reasons. So there's no problem with that. But per head population, when it comes to UFO sightings, we're pretty much on the level with the United States. And just as many fascinating incidents happen here as they do anywhere else.
So, starting as we normally do, take me back. I know you spoke about this on other podcasts and on different news sites and things, but what was it you wanted to do at 16? Where did you start out? What was you just working part-time?
I left high school in 1974, but long before you guys were even around, and it was a different era then. That the area that I lived in was mostly coal mining and factory work. There's still a few mills left. My father, for example, worked down the coal mine his entire life. I mean, on the coal face. There was no way I was going down the coal mine. It was too hard and too dirty. My father wouldn't have let me anyway. But I didn't have a clue. I mean, I finished the school I went to was hopeless. I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. I was, a gormless teenager. But I had this outside interest, which was all things paranormal. I'd also followed the space race for as long as I could, and I was interested in astronomy and not so much science fiction, but so all these kind of things seem to stick together. I mean, my first job, I was an apprentice painter and decorator. And again, I was hopeless at it. I mean, most of the time I went to the shop. I was the tea boy, which was great. Don't ever knock a tea boy, because they were essential on building sites back in the day. And then I got another job, and then another job. Like I said, I ended up working in what was West Germany over the winter of 1978 into 1979. Couldn't speak the language. So I asked my mum to send me some books so I could have a read on a night. And my interest in the UFO topic had increased a little bit by this time. Somehow, somewhere, she got a box full of paperbacks on UFOs, probably off one of the local markets. We used to live just outside of Leeds at the time in West Yorkshire. So I would sit down on a night and read these things, and not every night, but, So when I came back home, I'd got a bit more knowledge about the subject, and it intrigued me. And of course, I saw the Spielberg movie Close Encounters, and Leeds then, as now, has an evening newspaper. It's called the Yorkshire Evening Post. And my aunt, who lived round the corner, she brought it round one evening. She said, "Have you seen this?" And it was an advertisement, just a little small ad for the formation of the Yorkshire UFO Society, starting that Sunday in Leeds. Now, in those days, gentlemen, on a Sunday, everything used to close. I mean, literally, the pub would open from 12 to 2, and that would be it. The bus service was pretty much non-existent. But anyway, I caught a bus into Leeds. I didn't drive at that point. Found the location where this meeting was being held, and I never looked back. And that's how I got involved in the subject. At the same time, I started working in a factory. Initially, I thought I'd be here a few months, and I spent the next 21 years there as well. So both things sort of, were coincided. And that's how it all began for me.
Yeah, I mean, well, you're in the company of a German speaker over here.
Yeah. I mean, how good's your German now? Do you still remember a lot?
Ein Flaschen Bier bitte.
Okay, yeah. Ich
One
möchte
bottle
einen
of
auch.
beer, please.
Of course.
That gets you
That-
more than you need, doesn't it?
That's it.
That's all you
What
need.
more do you need to ask? I mean, everything else you can point and say, I want 3 of those, please, in any language.
I mean,
But no, my German was non-existent then, and it's pretty much is now.
well, fair enough. I mean, following that, I mean, after you sort of did spend time, when was the sort of time where you realized I want to dedicate my my time and my effort towards this, because this is something that many people don't really know about, especially in the UK.
Well, when I went to that meeting of the Yorkshire UFO Society, it was their first ever, run by 2 brothers called Mark and Graham Birdsall, both from Leeds. They'd been at it a couple of years already. And I don't know, guys, it's just, I felt this is where I belonged. They had a table selling books as well. There's no Amazon in those days, and I bought as many as I could afford. And because I was always a great reader, I loved to read, something my mum instilled in us, and I never looked back. And we used to have meetings there every Sunday once a month on a Sunday. I just knew this is what I wanted to do, and we were also fortunate that at that time there was a lot of sightings coming in from areas in and around the Yorkshire Dales, around the market town of Skipton, from the hills and moors. So again, just by coincidence, I seemed to have joined at the right time, where you just didn't go to a meeting and talk about things that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. This is what's happening now. And I thought, well, the next best thing to viewing one of these things is to speak to those that have, and I was off. I learned to drive a few years later and never looked back.
Because I was gonna say, like, obviously when you started out and you was just kind of, you went and participated, and what sounds like in your spare time, really, was it just like, was you looking at just international cases then? Was it just the big major cases that kind of caught
There were
your
a few
eye?
local ones. I mean, Graham and Mark put on a presentation that very first day, most of which was about things in and around Yorkshire, which you could identify with. And again, I volunteered to step forward and learn to work as a UFO investigator. And I hadn't been at it that long when I had a piece in my local newspaper, and a lady stepped forward from a town called Normanton in West Yorkshire. It's about 10 miles from Leeds. And again, at that point, there was coal mines all around here. And she told me that they'd seen a UFO land in the fields next to their house, her and her children. And we went to interview them. She was just like the people I'd grown up with. Her husband worked down the pit, just like my dad. The kids were outside. It was a lovely sunny day playing a ball game, but it's a made-up ball game. You won't. I think it might be local to this area. We used to put 3 clothes pegs up against the curb and a tennis ball, and you would knock them down, and then you had to put them back up before you were tagged with the ball. So it's a made-up game, and they were playing this game outside. And just after lunch, the lady in question was called Mrs. Westerman, and she's washing the dishes, and one of them come running in. Mum, there's an aeroplane landed in the field. And she went out, and it is literally 5 minutes from where I live now. And there's some ploughed fields and some electricity pylons, and there was this thing sat on the ground. She said it was shaped like a Mexican hat, silvery grey in colour. They went over towards it. The loose point of it at one point, there was a little dip. That's not there anymore, but it was then. And she says, we've come up the other side, there's these 3 tall humanoids, all dressed in white boiler suits with a visor on, they're waving something over the ground. She had to hold the children back, and these 3 beings went to the back of this thing. It rose up into a bright blue sky and took off at an angle. And she obviously was mesmerized by this. She was certain it was going to be on the local TV news that night. There was nothing. She thought, well, it'll be in the newspaper. Nothing. She even asked some of the, neighbors. And it was a beautiful day. Everybody was out. The M62 motorway, the biggest motorway in this part of the world, goes straight past Normanton. Nobody saw a thing. We even interviewed one of the children's friends. He'd gone home for lunch. And when he came back, he'd missed it all. And he wasn't best pleased, And they never called it a spaceship or aliens, just this thing. And but this was in my backyard, so to speak. This wasn't in Roswell, New Mexico. It wasn't in Varginha, Brazil. It's in Normanton in West Yorkshire, coal mining area. And that convinced it for me. I didn't really need much convincing, but I thought, these things are happening in my own backyard. And I was off and running, that was it. So I kind of joined, fortunately, the right time, and also things were being reported to us, so I could get my teeth into them. Mrs. Westerman, for example, wasn't allowed to take a photograph of her. We weren't allowed to use her real name. And a fascinating little encounter in little old Normanton. There you go.
Because I was going to say, because we've obviously been out and got interviews and done things like that before. And with anything, you try and sit there and piece it all together yourself. But was that one of the first ones you did? Was it your kind of mindset there? Was it kind of not like a naive mindset, but you like, oh my God, I believe everything I see, or was you still a bit like, okay, let me piece this together and get my own understanding of this?
Yeah, we were always taught to be objective, and I'd already looked at a couple of little things, but nothing like this. Most UFO sightings have a rational explanation. So when I was wanting to get involved, what Graham and Mark suggested to me, I get to know my local area. Where's the local airport? Is there a helicopter place nearby? Do you know anything about the stars and planets? Which I did, because if somebody says I've seen these, white, green and white flashing lights, it's the 10:30 to Malaga or whatever, it just is. I'd been to see one gentleman who wrote to me, to this marvelous spaceship. I mean, it was amazing, but I knew what it was. And I turned up at his house, I think about 1 o'clock one morning when he phoned me. And I said, he said, it's still there. I mean, went out into the back garden and there it was, and it's the planet Venus. I already knew that before I got there, but I thought, he didn't live that far from me. I'll take the time to go and tell him. And this guy wasn't an idiot, but as I'm walking back through his living room, there's a UFO book on his coffee table. So he'd recently retired, read his first book on UFOs, goes out into the back garden, probably the first time in his life he's ever looked up, and hey presto, there's this big, beautiful diamond in the sky,
And there's only one answer what it is.
It's Venus. I knew what it was before I went, but I wanted to explain it to him. So I already knew that most UFO sightings had a conventional explanation. But this wasn't just a UFO sighting. This lady said this thing's in the field, literally. She lived in a cul-de-sac, just at the end of the cul-de-sac. And there's these three creatures. So you either have to come to one of two conclusions. They're either lying or they're telling the truth. Because you couldn't misidentify this. So it wasn't a helicopter or anything like that. So I couldn't find any reason why they would lie. And then we stepped forward in time, and a couple of years back, again, I'd done a podcast for somebody, and I talked about this incident. And a lady emailed me from New Zealand. She says, you didn't mention that family's name. I just forgot, in Normanton. I used to live there. I'm from Normanton. And I says, it was a Mrs. Westerman. She says, my best friend was called Westerman.
No way.
And she still lives there, but she's married now. She got a different name. Her best friend was one of those children. And then last year, I did some TV work. And a gentleman emailed me. And he says, I've looked you up online, Philip, and you wrote something about this incident in Normanton. I said, yeah. He says, my partner was one of the kids. It was one of the children's friends. So I got her phone number. But I was saying, I'll come and interview you, but they now lived in Cornwall. So that was out of the. But she said, yeah, that was me. I'm one of those children. And so we had, they confirmed it all again. So There you go.
Yeah, all them years later, the story still
Yeah,
remains the same.
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, what year was that roughly that took place?
1980, 81. Without looking at it in my book,
Roughly.
yeah, I could never remember dates, even when I used to do history at school. You know, I remember 1066 and the Battle of Hastings and the Second World War and the First World War dates. That's about it. But it was either 1980 or 1981.
Because I mean, that kind of, I guess, leads on to then whenever you Google UK UFO cases and all things like that, the most prominent case, I guess, is the Alan Godfrey case, isn't it, in Yorkshire? What year was that one roughly?
That was
roughly
1979.
Yeah, that was rough. It's close. It's around the same time, around the same 10-year span, isn't it? I mean, what do you think is like? Why do you think it's such like, especially Yorkshire for some reason? Like, why do you think it's such like a hotbed for these cases?
Well, like I said, we had in the early to sort of mid 1980s, we had a lot of sightings from in and around Skipton in the Yorkshire Dales. So what we did, we literally parked a caravan on a place called Carlton Moor, just outside of Skipton, for a week. And we manned this caravan 24/7. We did some local media and we encouraged people to come and report things to us, which they did. You know, it's a little bit out of the way, so it's not somewhere you would just walk to, you know. And what we found just in that week, that some of the sightings there went back decades. And for whatever reason, they've just now been reported in greater profusion. So was it an increase in sightings, or were more people just reporting them? You know, it's the same when they do the crime statistics, isn't it? You know, has violent crime gone up, or are more people reporting it, or has it been recorded better than it used to be? That kind of thing. So, but what we did discover that the sightings in these areas were nothing new, and that's the same for sort of the Pennine chain of hills up through the Dales, down in the Peak District, for example. There's a rock face that's called Shining Bluff because of these strange lights that it gives off. And that goes back, you know, decades. So, you know, the sightings were nothing new. It just, maybe it's because we were there for someone to report it to. Up until, you know, that year in 1979, 1980, there was no Yorkshire UFO Society. So who did you report these things to? You know? So for whatever reason, they were just coming in, and we got stuck into it. We really did.
I mean, other sort of hotspots for UFO activity in the UK. I mean, I think we've all sort of heard of Rendlesham Forest as well, of that being a hotspot. And also another one I wanted to mention was the Falkirk Triangle, if you've heard of it. So it's Bonnybridge.
In Bonnybridge, yeah, that was in the 90s. Back in the 60s, of course, it was Warminster in Wiltshire. And they had all kinds of things reported there for you know, again, a protracted period of time. And there's other areas like Bonnybridge in Scotland. I wouldn't call Rendlesham a hotspot. It had one big event there, and there's been other things reported since then, but it's not, I don't know if it's a hotspot or not. But when you look at that particular location, it has lots of things going down. It's where the first radar testing was done, you know. So there had been all kinds of things happen in that area, not necessarily UFO-wise. So the whole area is steeped in mystery and history, shall we say.
That case, I mean, I went on a bit of a deep dive the other day, and that is not even like a weird case for me. That's like such a convincing,
yeah,
because it's not like we were talking about earlier. It's not like, oh, you know, it's just somebody that works wherever and they've got this story. There's a lot of evidence to back that. Well, maybe not even back it up, but to accompany the arguments, isn't it? Like, there's so much surrounding it. It's such, and I think it's one of, especially, I guess you know more than me, but being in the UK, it's one of the earliest ones, isn't it, where there's like actual significant like military and government like information to back it up with.
Well, government information is very little. But and of course, although it was a British base, it was leased by the Americans. Bentwaters and Woodbridge, you know, with Rendlesham Forest in between the two. What is curious about it, and it is a fascinating series of events. The main two witnesses are Jim Penniston and John Burroughs. So, like most of the witnesses, these were security. So they're base security officers. They're not, they're not airmen. They're not soldiers. They are security, but they're nonetheless part of the Air Force. These were the two gentlemen who first went into the Rendlesham Forest after these lights had been seen. They had a colleague stay with their vehicle, and Penniston and Burroughs went into the forest. Now, Jim Penniston says, I saw this about the size of an estate car, this triangular shaped object, either hovering or on legs, very close to the ground. It was kind of roughly triangular shaped. It was dark coloured. It was warm to touch. It had these markings on the side. And he said, I walked around it for about 45 minutes. You have his colleague, John Burroughs, who's literally standing a few yards away. Says, I didn't see anything of that. I didn't see any of that. All I saw was these funny lights. So there's questions to be asked there. I've told both gentlemen, I think they both encountered something very anomalous, but how do you both see something entirely different?
At the same time.
At the same time, so that's a big question, but it's all part of the mystique and the puzzles. The only thing about Rendlesham, and same with Roswell, is that it's now entered into the realms of folklore and mythology. Every retelling of the story, there's new bit. I'm not saying anybody's lying. I'm not accusing anyone of that, but it takes on another lease of life and things change. So you go right back to the beginning, which is December 1980, December the 26th, I believe. And you think it began with some strange lights in the forest. Jim Penniston, one of the first witnesses in the forest, now claims it's a vehicle from our future. They are time travelers.
I heard that, and that kind of threw me off a little bit.
Yeah. So how have we gone from some strange lights to time travelers? What happened in between? And it will change. I've no doubt. It's like Roswell. The first witness to Roswell was Matt Brazel, sheep farmer, and he saw these bits of junk on his ranch one morning. Also wood looking like things, and it almost looked like tinfoil. And we went from that to the cosmic Watergate. Hang on a minute, what happened in between? And of course, everybody who was witnessed to Roswell is now deceased. The difference is with Rendlesham, I think most, if not all, of the people involved are still alive. But it is nonetheless a fascinating series of events that lasted over the next couple of nights. But it's not as clear cut as one would imagine, so you have to remember that.
So say take just that case, for example, then. Was you still working, was you still doing your pieces in Yorkshire, your written pieces of work at that time, or was it kind of you put it on the back burner a little bit then?
No, what happened was, of course, very little was known about the Rendlesham case until 1983. Remember, it happened in December 1980. In 1983, one of the others that saw something on a different night was the Deputy Base Commander, Colonel Holt. And he wrote a memo, a one-page memo about it. And he sent the MOD a copy, and he sent his boss at the US Air Force a copy. Under the Freedom of Information Act in the States, this document was being released. We didn't have a Freedom of Information Act here. The MOD just said, we don't have anything. That's it. So that came out, and it made the headlines of what was the news of the world, Sunday newspaper. It's gone now. And it said UFO lands in Suffolk. That's official. And the official bit was Colonel Holt's memo, of course. And they spoke to another sort of whistleblower who'd used a pseudonym. And so the case was then out into the open. And so we tried, like anybody else, to try and solicit information from the MOD and got absolutely nowhere, as simple as that. But the case was out. So just let others get on with it. We kept an eye on it, of course, and we would continue our correspondence with, with the Ministry of Defence. And eventually, I got the memo, the whole memo released in the UK. We already had a copy of it, but it was from the US. And why they did it, I don't know. I just wrote and asked one day, and they said, here it is, it's attached. So things had changed. But when you read the Rendlesham file at the MOD, there's nothing in it of any great significance at all. It's internal memos going backwards and forwards. They didn't, certainly that department anyway, didn't do any investigation, didn't send anybody. And then the police, the local police were involved at the time. So there's documentation there. They weren't impressed either. But but how could you be? By the time the police got there was nothing for them to see. So you can understand that. What we have to remember, we don't investigate UFOs. We investigate sightings of UFOs, which is entirely different. It's been and gone by the time we turn up, or usually anyway. So, but a fascinating series of events nonetheless.
Yeah, I think the biggest kind of most convincing for people, the argument with that was the audio files, wasn't it? So much more than the memos.
Yeah, well, that again was Colonel Hall. He had a little dictaphone, took that out, and he recorded bits and pieces of it, and that was later released. Colonel Holt never wanted the memo releasing. He was happy in his job. He didn't want anything to do with it. But he's now happy in retirement. But I think if he could turn the clock back, he would say, "Don't release it." But not for any reason other than he wanted a peaceful life.
I think that's like with most cases, isn't it? It kind of gathers power and builds up, and the people involved are just like, this is not what I intended for it.
Yeah,
most people just wanted to live a quiet life. Like again, that Alan Godfrey case, he was just a police officer going about his nightly shift, wasn't he? And then that happened. I mean, I know you're still doing work, and you published that book, was it a few years ago now, about the UK sightings. What are some of them that I'm guessing you spoke to a lot of different people for a lot of different research about that one. How many times do you sit there and go, you know what, I'm not believing this one?
I don't, when I wrote the book UFO Landings UK, came out last year. I actually wrote it during lockdown. I've been, ever since that first landing case in Normanton, I'd been putting cases to one side, and in the early days, they were paper files. They later became, digital. And there weren't that many that didn't make it into the book. There are some that are extremely bizarre. I mean, bizarre. But my intention was, I'll put these in the book, but I'm not going to tell the reader what he should or shouldn't believe. You read it and you reach your own conclusion. I'm not here to indoctrinate you and say, you must believe me. I've been at this for 40 some years, No, not at all. Here's what the information I've gathered. Here are the case histories. Here are the witnesses. Draw your own conclusions, and that's exactly what I did. And I'm still doing with the book that I'm working on now, will just allow you to read it and come to your. So if I didn't put it in the book, you wouldn't be able to reach your own conclusion on that particular case, would you? That's almost like censorship, but no, so there was a couple I did think about it because they are so weird, but I thought, no, this is what it's all about. And they're all in there. And that book is called UFO Landings UK, of course. So it's just that kind of report here in the UK, nowhere else.
In the book then, what would you say is what like we said before, you've been doing this longer than we've been alive. But what's one, if you was to pick one case, you go, okay, that's the one that's kind of stuck with me, that you sit there and go, you can write it up and spend weeks writing it. But with anything, I think even when we just do it on, maybe not UFOs, but just news articles on a basic level, some stories you go, that it crops back up in your mind every so often. Like, what do you think would be a story for you that you've written and gone, that
I don't know, there's quite
me.
A few. It's difficult, but one I've mentioned before is a chap called John Warren. And this was in May 1943. So it's right in the middle of the Second World War. Mr. Warren was at a place called RAF Ludham in Norfolk, and he was he worked on the aircraft there. He used to load the ammunition on them. He wasn't a pilot or anything like that. And he said, I got a pass one night to go to a local dance in a village a few miles away. Great, you know. So off he goes to the dance, but he misses the last train back. And it was about 12 miles. So he thought, I've got no choice. I have to walk back. And in those days, of course,
couldn't Uber it back then, could you?
No, but if you were late, you were in big trouble. So he sets off walking. Obviously, it's dark. And as he's approaching the base, on the grass verge, there is this light up ahead. And he knows that it shouldn't be there. As he approaches it, there is a humanoid figure stood at the side of the grass verge, almost like one of the cigars selling Indians, made out of wood. And it's got a box on its chest, and there's a light coming out of the top of this box, which is shining on its face, and it distorts the face. I don't know if you ever did that as a kid with a torch and put it under your face. Give that kind of
when
effect.
you tell scary stories or something around a campfire or something.
And he says, then behind it was some more of these things, and there was a thing on the ground shaped like a bell tent. And he absolutely was terrified. He ran back in. Luckily, one of his friends was waiting up for him and let him in through a window. And he told him about it. And I'm sat in Mr. Warren's front room discussing this with him. He came forward after I did some local publicity, and he just happened to live a mile up the road. And he's telling this story. You can see that far off look in his face, while he's telling it. And he says, Philip, obviously when we went to a dance, we didn't take any sidearms. He said, but if I'd had my sidearm that night, I'd have shot this thing. I would have shot it, he said, because I knew it wasn't one of us. And if it wasn't one of us, it had to be one of them, i.e., the Germans. And he said, but I would have shot it. No doubt about it. And this was before, flying saucers were popular. That didn't happen until 1947. So it's before that date. And it was just the fact that it was a local gentleman, he's now obviously in retirement, living a normal life, when this most bizarre thing happened outside an RAF base in the middle of the Second World War. And it's just the fact that I told him, I think it's a great honor for me to be sitting here and talking to you. And he said, I have no idea to this day what it was, Philip. He said, I'd had a couple of beers at the dance. He says, but that was it. And make of it what you will, gents. I just found it fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, do you have a theory? Because it does the rounds on the internet and different places and things. But do you have a theory with your research why there is such an increase in sightings around military bases and nuclear test centres? Why? What would be your belief around that?
That's a
idea?
fallacy, gents. There is no increase in sightings around RAF bases or military installations. If you added all the UFO sightings up and put the ones that were sighted near military bases to one side, they would only form a tiny, tiny percentage. So most UFO sightings are not near military bases at all. You have to remember, up until the end of the Cold War, we had a lot more active military installations in the UK than we do now. And because it's such a small country that we live in, it wasn't necessarily that far to a military base or a military installation of one kind or another, So that is a fallacy. It doesn't. Some people will tell you that it's not the case. Most UFO sightings are seen by Joe Public, in just going to work, walking the dog, out with the kids, whatever. Nothing to do with military installations.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
I mean, there are stories also that I guess are too strange. I mean, I read about this story where this man called Alfred Bertu, I think it was in 1983, I want to say,
Yeah.
where he was obviously approached by beings, and obviously he spoke with them and said, what's going on, and obviously they said, we can't do what we wanted with you because you're too old. I mean, what do you
Yes.
make of that? Is
Yeah,
how
I know.
believable
I
is
know
that?
the case. When he was down by the river, Mr. Batou was originally investigated by a chap called Timothy Good, I believe, and Timothy wrote about it. But yeah, but again, it's a gentleman on his own. It's a very interesting little case. It's actually in my book, so it didn't get kicked out. And there was another one that's not in there from just outside of Leeds, and a very similar. And again, it's there's a chap, and he sees these lights outside his house, and this thing has landed in a field not far from where he is. It's now a built-up area. It wasn't then, and he goes to this thing, and they say this a similar type of thing to him. You're a bit too old for this, really. See you later. So Batou's not a one-off in that respect, but it's an interesting little case. And again, all you can do is put that information out there and allow people to draw their own conclusions. And from a research point of view, of course, by publishing these events that you think are a one-off, there might be a colleague, across the pond or in Japan or Australia said, "Oh, we've got one just like that or very similar to that." So you then find out it's not a one-off. There are others like that as well. And that's one of the beauties of digital communication. You can put it on on Facebook or on our website, and it can be read by potentially millions in one go. And that has happened. I know it was the same sighting, but for example, Mrs. Westerman, the children coming forward all those years later to confirm it. And that was all down to digital technology, me talking to someone like your good selves today.
Yeah, opened up the conversation, which can literally be, spoken about literally around the world. So, why I wanted to speak to you, I want to get your opinion on this as well. I'm sure, if you've seen the Amazon documentary, The Moment of Contact, the one about
No, but
Brazil.
I know about the case.
Yeah. Did you know about the case before it all kind of blew up recently?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it, because obviously they mention it in the series, in the movie and all like this, but they say it was outside of that area of Brazil, it was not known about for the general public. Was it well known to you, being like in the know kind of thing, in inverted commas? Was it well known for people like
Yeah, they're
yourself?
absolutely well known. There was a chap who's died recently, an old friend of mine called AJ Jabard from Brazil. Published a magazine there for many, many years. He was a UFO researcher, and they looked into it. I had a friend go out there and look into it as well. Dr. Roger Lear from the United States. Roger went out there, and of course, Dr. John Mack, Harvard professor. Dr. Mack went out there. Initially, Dr. Mack was positive about it, but later wasn't that keen on the idea of it. He had his doubts, so to speak. Sadly, again, none of these gentlemen are now with us. But so within the UFO community, the case was well known about, and I know James Fox. I met him. I was a bit surprised when he chose this particular case for a new documentary, to be perfectly honest. But again, all James can do is to make his documentary and put the information out there. And if you want to watch it, watch it. If you don't, you don't. I will get round to watching it. I will watch it. But if it was me, somebody said, "I've got a budget for you to make a documentary," I wouldn't have chosen that case. And but what I will say is that South America en masse, for whatever reason, probably has some of the most bizarre UFO encounters anywhere, of which the Varginha case is one of them. That whether it's I don't know, their history, their mythology, or that colours it, I don't know. But they do have some very bizarre encounters that come from there. That's why I now run a small publishing company called Flying Disc Press. One of the books that I published was UFO Contacts in Brazil by Tiago Tichetti, a good friend of mine in Brazil, and the Varginha case is in it, so it is pretty well known.
Yeah, because I mean that's all I've said. Obviously, I don't have that much of a wealth of knowledge. You hear it over like surface level thing. You go, oh, that's interesting, but I didn't realize you'd assume a case with that much information and with that much kind of going on within it. You would have heard. I know it was the 90s, wasn't it? So obviously before we was born. But you'd think it'd still be like you'd almost assume it would be like a Roswell case or something where it'd be like, oh,
Yeah.
this boy that was young in the military picked up this being and took him to a hospital and things like that happened, and yet it isn't, is it? In terms of
No,
global.
but we also remember there is the language barrier as well. Brazil speak Portuguese. So it was one of the things I tried to do when I launched Flying Disc Press was to try and break the language barrier. First book I ever published was UFOs over Poland. Lots of fascinating cases from Poland that have never seen the light of day because of the language. I followed it up by one from Romania. I published 3 books from Italy, one from Japan, one from Brazil. So the language barrier has probably a significant role to play in this kind of thing. But you have to remember, UFO sightings, as far as the media are concerned, are here today, gone tomorrow. What we used to say, what's today's UFO news is tomorrow's fish and chip paper. What you wrap your fish and chips in. So from a media perspective, it doesn't surprise me. But it was well known was the case, and I'm just surprised James took that one on. But it'll be. I shall watch it on Netflix when I get a chance. But there are cases from yesteryear that once you do start to dig into them, you can now uncover a lot more information than you could before because of this that we're sat in front of now, and it's amazing what can be found that wasn't available at the time to local investigators. So the case, perhaps if John Mack was still alive now and he looked at what James Fox had now uncovered, he might change his mind somewhat, But it's an interesting case, and I will watch it.
So if Netflix come to you tomorrow and said, okay, we're giving you X amount of money, and we said, we've heard what you said about the James Fox documentary, it's good, but you'd pick another one. Yeah. What would be your immediate thought? Where would you go, okay,
well,
this is where I want to go?
We're already doing it. Whether it ends up on Netflix is a different matter. But a very famous case from 1973, it's a place called Pascagoula in Mississippi. 2 gentlemen went fishing on the river there one night. Charles Hickson, age 42, Calvin Parker, almost 19, when they had a close encounter. They were fishing. You see blue lights appeared from behind them. They thought it was the police because they thought they might be trespassing. Turned around, it wasn't the police. There was this rugby ball shaped thing descending. An opening appeared. They were grabbed by 3 extremely bizarre looking humanoid creatures, taken on board, examined, etc., put back. They ended up within an hour or so at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, telling them what had happened. That was recorded by the sheriff. The sheriff also put both men in a room together and recorded them in private. And they were still talking about it. And it hit the headlines and went around the world. And Charles Hickson was quite happy to talk about it. Calvin Parker wanted nothing to do with it. It sent him off his head, basically. So in 2018, I contacted Calvin. Charlie was already dead. And persuaded him, along with his wife, to write his own book. He'd never told the full story. So he told the story for the first time. And then out of nowhere, and complete to our surprise, other people started commenting, well, I saw that night. And one particular comment on Calvin made a little 8-minute film with the local TV. Somebody put it on YouTube. One of the comments was, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they saw it. So we got in touch with them, interviewed them, and I've been working with a colleague called Dr. Irina Scott in Ohio, and others came forward, or we found others, and we've amassed a whole host of both documentary and eyewitness testimony that will all be coming out this year because it's the 50th anniversary. For example, Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker said, when these creatures grabbed me, Charlie said, felt a scratch on my arm. Calvin, while on board, said, I'm laid on this glass table. They take my trousers and my shoes and socks off, and they stick something in my foot and it hurts. Okay. So when I started working with Calvin to write his book, I said, have you got any documents, photographs? He says, no, all gone. We were hit by Hurricane Katrina. Don't even have my wedding photographs. No pictures of my kids when they're little. All gone. So I started pestering the various UFO researchers and groups that were around at that time. The Center for UFO Studies in the States sent me a file, PDF, most of which was news cuttings. But right in the middle of this file is a one-page typed, so it's on an old typewriter, dated October the 13th, so it's 2 days after the encounter. And it discusses a physical examination of both men. They're stripped down to their underwear. And he says, and he found puncture wounds in inverted commas on Charles Hickson's forearm and on Calvin Parker's foot. Bear in mind, both gentlemen had said they felt these. And it says, here's a photograph of them. There were no photograph, no photograph. About a year later, the gentleman who sent me this file got an email from him out of the blue. And he says, Philip, I assume you've already got these, but I thought I'd send them anyway. And it's the photographs of these marks on Charlie's forearm and Calvin's foot.
Wow.
So you have witness testimony, you have one written typed document detailing them, and then you have the photographs. Now, each one on its own, okay, is interesting, but when you put all three together, then it makes evidence.
Yeah. Say, at first, when you said, "Oh yeah, all the evidence got destroyed," I had red flags going off, thinking, okay, it was this many years ago. No, you've got no evidence of everything, and that took you a year to gather all of that, then, roughly.
Yeah, I mean, so when we're going public with this, I was contacted by a Greek colleague. Didn't know him. It's called Stephanos. And he says in 1981, so it's 8 years after the event, he says, I was in the Greek Merchant Navy. I was a radio operator and a UFO researcher, and I docked in Pascagoula. And I went to interview Charles Hickson, which I did. And he said, I went to the police department to see if they could help me with anything. And they said, go and speak to this fella. Excuse me. He was a chap called Emmanuel Sigalis. He was a clergyman, pastor of Greek origin. So they give him his address, and Stephanos goes, meets this guy, interviews him and a colleague and a church volunteer on October the 11th, 1973, the night of the encounter, were en route to like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that they used to chair and run by the church. When they saw this thing come right across the road in front of them, off towards roughly where Charlie and Calvin were. They drew a picture of it for Stephanos. Now, the gentleman, so we had the interview with this gentleman, but he died. But what about this young lady in the back of the car? And we managed to find her name, and she was nowhere to be found to begin with. And then a colleague of mine helped me, and he says, I think I might have located her, or somewhere where she might be. She'd only been in Pascagoula for a year, and she was a church volunteer. But the church that she was had a specific name, and I managed to find the church, and it had a website. And I looked on this a website, and her name was Hallmark. That was her surname. And there were some sermons by somebody called Hallmark. And I'm thinking, could this be her elderly husband or perhaps sons? So the church had a general email address. I just emailed it and said, I'm looking to speak to this lady. I didn't tell them what about. I said, she worked in Pascagoula, Mississippi as a volunteer with this pastor back in the 1970s. And I left it at that. So about a month later, hey presto, this lady contacted me. And I said, well, I can't hang around now. I can't, not tell her. So I told her, and she wrote back and clarified everything for us. So we've got Stephanos's original interview from 1981, and now we had this lady all these years later. She says, in fact, it was me that first spotted it. So I'm looking out, I'm in the back, and I'm looking out of the window. These two guys are talking, and I think she started praying at one point. She thought it was something, heavenly. And but again, it took quite a while before we found her. But had it not been for digital technology, we probably never would have. That's just one example, and she's in the book. And she sent me a photograph of herself. We're allowed to use her real name, and she is just one of many. She didn't step forward. We found her, and even just yesterday, I found a couple more people who said, well, I saw something that night. And we're in the process of asking them for an interview. So the book will be out later this year. It's called Beyond Reasonable Doubt, The Pascagoula Alien Abduction. As we speak now, anytime now, there'll be a graphic novel out about it. And the documentary is in the editing stages already. So that's, almost finished. When it will come out, which network it's on is not down to me. It's down, to the company in question, but it's all done.
Yeah.
So there you go. I don't have to ask Netflix. It's already
It's
done.
already there. You're one step ahead. I mean, when you do that, when you it's obviously not a shot in the dark when you email like the pastor and things, but how do you sit there and you've got to be a bit nervous? So when you sit there and go, is this the person that I've been looking for months?
Absolutely.
Do you still is it a
yeah.
mix of fear and excitement when you hit send on that email?
My wife said I was like a man on a mission, because there was a time when we were either finding them, certainly during lockdown, because more people took to social media and things like that. And you'd have an email, you'd have a discussion on Facebook about it. And then somebody would say, I'll give you one example. Where they were fishing that night, Highway 90 is right next to them. This huge, great toll bridge goes over the river, massive. One of the criticisms was, well, nobody on the bridge saw anything. Step forward, Mr. Charles Anderson. He says, I'm driving over the bridge that night with my wife. And because he's on the left, he said there was this thing down below me. So I thought it was going to crash. And it was blue. Bear in mind, Charlie and Calvin, this thing had blue lights on it. So I thought it was going to crash. He said, I only watched it for about 30 seconds. Well, 30 seconds is quite a long time to view something. And he said, I used to have an aunt who lived down near the river. And he said, I went down. So this is on Thursday. This happened. He said, I went down there on the Saturday. And he said, the first thing she said to me was, you'll never guess what I saw the other night, And so again, Mr. Anderson has been interviewed for the documentary. And he just put a little post on Facebook saying, I've been interviewed. And there was a lady said, oh, I saw the lights that night. So I contacted her and yes, basically she's putting the children to bed. She goes to close the curtains and she's about a mile or so away, but it's got a good view when she sees these blue lights. And she was actually the cousin of Mr. Anderson. And she didn't know he'd seen something. And she didn't know vice versa, So we had relatives, that had seen something that night, but neither had told each other of the story, And again, we had another gentleman, sadly was passed away, but we interviewed him before this. Again, they still build ships on the Pascagoula River. He was working on a ship at night. And he said, I was a crane driver. He's called Mr. Lewis Lee. And he said, I got into the crane, into my cab. It's about 8 or 10 feet off, up in the air. And he says, there's this thing out over the water. He says, I've seen anything like it. Again, this bluey silver thing. And he says, it's not up in the skies. It's right down over the river. he watched it for about 10 minutes, and they were having some mechanical problems with his crane, and his mate shouted to him. I won't repeat what he said, but and he says, so I had to attend to that when I looked back, it had gone. Now, the way we found out about Mr. Lee, Calvin Parker was doing a book signing one day in the town. And Mr. Lee went up to him and said, can I buy a book, Mr. Parker? Yeah. And he said, oh, by the way, I saw the thing that night. And he walked away. But luckily for us, somebody had been taking photographs. And there was this gentleman buying a book from Calvin. We didn't know his name. So we put it on social media. And a relative contacted me. She said, I think she said it was her uncle. And I said, well, can you ask him if you can speak to him? He said, yeah. And we interviewed him, and he said, I'll happily tell you, and he told us the whole thing. But so he didn't step forward, kind of, we had to go and track him down. And we've been doing that ever since. Like I said, just yesterday, I've had a couple more people who've made comments about seeing something that night. And we're chasing them now, we're literally chasing them now.
So you're not willing to put it down to a group hallucination then?
No, because what happened was we had sightings a few days before the Parker and Hicks, and afterwards as well. Whatever happened at Pascagoula on 11th of October 1973 seemed to be the peak. That was the epicenter. And we had a wave of sightings across the US. I'll give you another example. November the 6th, 1973, in the same river, but a bit further out, 2 little fishing boats with 9 people on them. And they're casting their nets. And they saw a circular object about 30 feet in diameter underneath the water. So it's in
submerged,
the river.
Beneath the water.
And it was a white, they said it was like a brownish white colour because it was probably white, but the silt in the river turned it give it a tint to it. And they got close enough to it that were able to hit it with an oar. It went clunk. And then the lights would go out and it'd appear somewhere else. They went to the Coast Guard station, reported it in person. The Coast Guard sent a boat out. They saw it and they also hit it and it went clunk. And I have all the Coast Guard documents detailing the events that night. And a colleague of mine, what happened was the Coast Guard asked everyone to go back the next day in daylight. They put them all on the side of the road and took a photograph of them. On the back of the photograph, all their names and all their ages. So again, colleagues supplied me with that photograph. There's only one person living out of it. We found him, we tracked him down and interviewed him, and he's in the book.
So do you think now then, I mean, especially as we've mentioned with, it's not the ease of social media, but it's easier to track people down and find people. And if stories like this and the Mississippi River keep coming out and it keeps building momentum, do you think kind of the burden of proof is shifted a little bit now? Like the burden before, it was all, oh, we've got any photos, or we've got any videos, it doesn't exist, oh, we'll pass you off. But do you think now the burden of proof has almost shifted to like these organisations? I guess even maybe like government organisations where they've gone for so long saying no, it doesn't exist. Can they keep saying that, or has there got to come a time where
I don't know if they have said that. It's a kind of a play on words. We've called the book Beyond Reasonable Doubt because while I'm actually writing it, I'm thinking if we were to take all of these people to a courtroom, we could prove that something bizarre happened around that time. We can't say they were abducted by aliens, but I'm quite convinced that we could prove something. I've made a comment on the documentary. These were 2 ordinary men who encountered the extraordinary. And I'll leave it at that. Again, you draw your own conclusions, but I think we could prove that something bizarre happened that night. If you go back through the files of our own Ministry of Defence, all the UFO files have been provided to the National Archives. Consistently, they have always admitted that there's things in the sky that they can't identify. But it's never, as far as they're concerned, been a threat to the defence of the United Kingdom And unless it is, they're not interested. So whether you believe that or not, it's a different matter. But they've consistently said for decades, we're quite aware there's things that we can't identify. And they've left it at that, you know. So, and I don't think things have changed that much. Because if you think about it, UFOs are here 1 second and gone the next. So it doesn't matter whether it's me, you, or the Secretary of State for Defense, or, you know, whoever it is, they're still being here and gone tomorrow.
Yeah,
we don't investigate UFOs, we investigate sightings of UFOs. And that doesn't matter whether it's me, you, or the Department of Defense.
I mean, it is mad. I mean, how they say, oh yeah, we don't know what it is, but nah, it'll be all right. We can leave it there. It'll be fine. You'd think well, I guess maybe that's just me, but I'd look to maybe investigate it a bit more. But I mean, we've passed an hour now, so I guess just kind of one last question from me, unless you've got any more.
Yeah, I mean, I also just wanted to find out. I mean, when you do reach out to people to find out about their stories, how do you feel? As you know, you are obviously extracting the information and finding out about their stories, but on a deeper level, is it also reassuring them that their story won't be mocked or, you know, laughed at? It'll actually be taken seriously, because there are quite a few people who just dismiss this as, you know, it's not true. Or is it?
I mean, we always offer to release any information in confidence. So there's one or two people in the book where we haven't used their real name. Most of the people are of an age now, 60s, 70s, where they couldn't care less. You know, yes, you can use my real name. So we can always change their name and their identity and things like that. So that is always offered to them. But what is curious, when the Pascagoula case first broke in 1973, there was an awful lot of mickey taking, ridicule. Oh, you know, two country bumpkins must have been on the hooch, you know. Listen, guys, I've been drunk many a times, and I never saw UFOs when I was, you know.
I can back you up on that one too.
Exactly. But when Calvin came out of the woodwork in 2018, kind of the opposite had happened. They took him seriously. I think pretty much all of the interviews he's done, nobody's poked fun at him. So, you know, it is a different time now. The ridicule factor is still there. The stigma is still there, but it's not as great as it used to be. You know, how long that will last, we've no idea. It could change tomorrow. But there'll always be people that say, well, I don't believe it. But Calvin, like many others, said, look, I don't care whether you believe me or not. I'm telling the truth. That's it. You know, end of story.
Yeah, so as I think it's becoming a bit of a tradition now, we'll end it. Go back to when you were 16 then. And, you know, you started out, you went to that event, and it took you to where you are today. What do you think's driving you forward? Is it just constant curiosity? Is it that you want to, you know, help get other people's stories out? What is it that's pushing you forward?
I was always one of those chaps, one of those fellas, if there's a button that said do not press, I'm not sure I'd press it, but I'd want to know what would happen if I did press it, you know? And it's the same with the UFO subject. I've been involved for an awful long time now, 40 plus years. And you just sometimes reach a point where you think, I think I'm onto something now. And then something will crop up and it will just say, I forget it. You know, it blows away your hypotheses or your theories. And I am forever grateful to the subject as well. I mean, I was like I said, a gormless teenager, left school with no qualifications, got involved in this subject when I was 21 years of age. And it's taken me around the world. You know, I've met people and done things I would never have done were it not for being involved in this subject. And that continues to be to this very day. And the fascination has never, ever left me, you know, and I don't think it ever will.
And what's next for you in terms of, obviously you are developing the book and the documentary, but aside from that, is there anything else in the pipeline that we're interested in?
I run Flying Disc Press. So I have a whole host of new books by authors from here and from overseas, already lined up for this year and next year, all extremely different from each other. And I've been working with a journalist on a piece at the moment. Whether that will come to any fruition, I don't know. I've been asked to work on another documentary series. Whether that will happen, I don't know. But if not, I will continue to publish the book. And I know something will happen. I don't have to advertise for it. Things come my way, you know, and I'm forever grateful.
So if people want to find you then, if they want to know more and anticipate the documentary and all that you do, where's best to find you? Is it YouTube, Twitter? What's best?
I'm on Twitter. I don't use it that often, but I'm on there. But Facebook, I'm regularly on, so they'll find me easily on Facebook. If you just put Flying Disc Press into Google, you'll find me. You know, so I'm very. How did you guys find me, for example?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I found you through. I think I just found you through like different podcasts online and YouTube videos. But yeah, if what I'll do, I'll attach all your links and everything that you want to share, like in the description
Of course.
of the audio. So yeah, and then
I know where I live in Pontefract in West Yorkshire. I know it's not the centre of the world, but it's not that difficult to find. You know.
By the centre, it's the centre of the UFO activity. I'll tell you that much. Anyway, thank you for doing that. Thank you for doing this today, and I've definitely learned more.
Same here. Yeah.
I can be down this rabbit hole for another 3 hours if we can
Absolutely.
continue. But we've all got places to be and people to see. So yeah, thank you again for coming on. And maybe if you get any more stories or when the documentary comes out, you can come back and we can talk about it more.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.